Hey guys, and welcome back. This video is really exciting because by the end of it, we'll have an actual fun game where enemies will be spawning automatically. So we're going to be making a spawner script. Alright, so without further ado, let's get started. The first thing that we need to do is to define positions where the enemies will be spawning from. To do so, I'll right click in the hierarchy and I'll create a simple empty game object. Now, to help visualize easier where the empty game object is situated, we'll head over to the top of the inspector. We'll click on this dropdown and we'll now choose one of these icons. If you don't see anything, just head over to the gizmos dropdown in the scene view and increase the size of 3D icons. Okay, perfect. Now we have got a cool way of visualizing where this empty game object is placed. But as you can see, it does not affect the game itself. We're now going to rename this empty game object to something that describes it a little better, like spawn points. Let's now take the move tool and place it just above the top of the game view so that our enemies will spawn off screen and they'll then fall down into view. We're now going to duplicate this spawn point a couple of times by pressing Ctrl D or Command D, and then we'll space them out so that they cover the entire length of the game view. Okay, we're now going to create another empty game object. We'll rename this one to spawner. Let's now go down to the scripts folder and we'll create a new C# script that I'll call spawner. Once it has been created, we'll drag and drop it onto the spawner object that we just created. Let's now double click on it to open it up inside of our text editor. Let's start off by creating all the variables that we'll need in this script. The first variable is going to be a public transform array of spawn points. This variable is basically going to store all the spawn points that we just created in Unity. And more specifically, it will store the transform components that are attached to them. So if you quickly go back to Unity and select one of the spawn points, you'll see that every game object in Unity has this transform component. This component is what defines the position, rotation, and scale, in other words size, of any object. So that is why we're storing the transform component of the spawn points, because we need to have access to the position of those spawn points. Moving on, we're going to create a public game object array of hazards. This variable is going to store all 3 of our hazard enemies in an array. The type of this array is game object, which basically refers to the entire game object. If we now save our script and go back to Unity, we can fill these variables out right now. So we'll open up the spawn points array, we will type in the number of spawn points that we have in our game, and then we'll just drag and drop each spawn point into a slot. Then we'll open up the hazards array and we will choose 3 for the size, and we will drag and drop our 3 hazard prefabs into their slots. Okay, the next variables that we need to create are variables that are going to affect the time between each spawn. Basically how fast each hazard will spawn since the last one. Okay, so I'll start off by creating a private float variable called time between spawns, which is the variable that we will use to know when is the next time that we need to spawn a new enemy. So if this variable is equal to 2, it means that an enemy will spawn every 2 seconds. Then we're going to create a public float variable that we will call start time between spawns, which is the variable that we will use to reset our time between spawns variable. Don't worry if you don't understand this right now, it'll be much clearer in just a second. All the code for the script is going to go inside of the update function because we don't only want to run this code once but multiple times and very often. Okay, so I'm going to start off by creating an if statement that is going to check if the time between spawns variable is less than or equal to 0. For now, inside of the curly brackets, I'll just write a comment that says that we want to spawn an enemy. So if the time between spawns variable is less than or equal to 0, we want to spawn a new hazard. Else, so if the time between spawns variable is not less than or equal to 0, then we want to decrease the time between spawns variable so that eventually it reaches 0 so we can spawn a new enemy. To do so, I'll simply say time between spawns minus equals time.delta time. This line basically acts like a counter. It slowly decreases the time between spawns variable so that eventually it reaches 0. Once it reaches 0, then the if statement will now be true and so we can now spawn a new hazard. Let's now write the code to spawn the hazards. To do so, we need to first of all choose a random spawn point to spawn him from, and we need to choose a random hazard from the hazards array. Okay guys, so pause the video here and try to figure out how you can choose a random spawn point and a random enemy from both arrays. I'll be back with a solution once you're done. Okay, so this is how you do it. let's create a transform variable called random spawn points that is going to be equal to the spawn points array. And for the index, we're going to create a random number, so random.range between 0 and spawn points.length. Okay, so for the random enemy, it's pretty similar. We're going to create a game object variable this time called random hazards that is going to be equal to the hazards array with an index, you guessed it, of random.range between 0 and hazards.length. Great job guys if you're able to figure out this little challenge. The next challenge that I've got for you is to actually figure out how we're going to spawn our random hazards at the random spawn points. I'll let you research on the internet how to spawn objects in Unity, and once you think you've got the answer, I'll show you the correction. Okay, so the way that we spawn objects in Unity is really quite simple. We're just going to use the built-in Unity function called instantiate. Then we need to pass in 3 bits of information inside of this function. The first parameter that this function requires is the actual object that we want to spawn. So in this case, I'll type in random hazards. Then we need to specify where do we want to spawn the object, and so this time I'll pass in random spawn points dot position to get the actual position of the transform components. And finally, we need to specify at what rotation do we want to spawn the hazard from, and for this we'll just type in quaternion.identity, which just basically means no particular rotation. Alright, we're now done spawning our random hazard at our random spawn points. There is one very important thing that we have forgotten to do, which is that we need to reset our time between spawn variable. Because for now, we're entering the if statement because the variable is less than or equal to 0. But then, when the update function gets called again, the variable will still be equal to 0, and so we will again spawn a new enemy. And it will continue to do so every single frame, and we don't want that. So to fix it, right after we have spawned our enemy, we'll just type in time between spawns is equal to start time between spawn, so that we are resetting the counter back to its starting value each time we spawn a new enemy. Okay guys, let's now save our script and go back to Unity. I'll choose 1.25 seconds for the start time between spawn variable, and now let's press play. As you can see, everything is working perfectly. This is amazing. Now you can of course change the start time between spawns variable to make the game as hard or easy as you like. The smaller the variable, the harder it will be. Talking about difficulty, let's implement a very simple difficulty system so that the difficulty of the game gets harder and harder as we play it. In our game, we want the difficulty to increase, but we don't want it to increase forever. We want some sort of maximum difficulty in our game. For that reason, I will create a public float variable called min time between spawns. This variable, like we discussed, is what we're going to use to have a maximum difficulty in our game so that the game doesn't get too hard or even impossible to play. So with this variable, we'll be able to choose what is the fastest time that each next enemy will spawn at. So if you choose 0.5, it means that at the maximum difficulty of our game, each enemy will spawn after half a second has passed. The last variable that we need is a public float variable that I'll call decrease. This variable will dictate of how much do we want to decrease the time between spawns every time there is a new enemy that gets spawned in our game. So for example, if the time between spawns start at 2 and we choose a decrease of 0.25, well when the enemy spawns, the next enemy will spawn after only 1.75 seconds, then 1.5 seconds, then 1.25 seconds, and so on. You get the picture. Okay, so now once we have spawned in our enemy, we will check if the start time between spawns variable is greater than the min time between spawns variable. So basically we are checking if the game is still easier than the max difficulty. And if it's true, so if the game is still easier than the max difficulty, then we will decrement the start time between spawns variable by our decrement variable so that the game gets a little bit harder. Okay, that's all we need guys. Let's press Ctrl S or Command S if you're on a Mac, and let's go back to Unity. Let's now fill in all of our variables. Okay, so the start time between spawns variable dictates the difficulty of the game at the very start of our game. So I'll choose something like 1.25. Then we need to choose the maximum difficulty of the game. So for now, I'll choose something like 0.5. Then for the decrement variable, which basically dictates how fast are we going to go from the easiest difficulty to the hardest difficulty, I'll choose a very small value like 0.1. Okay, let's now press play and enjoy the fruit of our hard work. This is really amazing guys. We have now got an actual game that is pretty fun to play. Have fun of course tweaking all the public variables so that you can choose the exact difficulty that you want for your game. You can be so proud guys of yourself to have made the game work. Even if you don't understand everything, the fact that you're able to follow along and make a game is already a massive achievement. Anyways, that is all for this video. I'll see you very soon. Cheers. Okay, one quick note. When the player dies, we're getting this error message. This is because the player, when he is dead, no longer exists in the game, and when a new enemy gets spawned, that enemy is looking for a game object in the scene that has the tag of player. But because there is no object in the scene with the tag player, it causes this error. To fix this, we're going to quickly go back inside of the spawner script, and we will make a public game object variable called player. Then we're going to wrap this if-else statement inside of another if statement, which is going to check if the player variable is not equal to null. In other words, if he exists. If the player exists, then everything is fine and we can continue spawning enemies. But if he doesn't exist, it means that he is dead, and so we will stop spawning enemies. Okay guys, so if you save the script and go back to Unity, you just now have to drag and drop the player character onto the player variable that we just created, and now if you press play and when the player dies, you shouldn't get any more this annoying error message. Okay, that's all. Cheers guys.